Brandon suggested that I get up here and pose the question, does knowledge matter? Then kind of lean into the mic and say, it does, and then drop the mic and just walk off the stage. I really wanted to do that, but the reason I'm not doing that is because the mic seems attached. Otherwise, I would have done it, I promise. And it seems less dramatic for me to just unplug this and go ding. So instead, what I'll do is I'll actually stay up here and I'll give you the talk and try and answer the question as to whether knowledge matters. Spoiler alert, I am going to say that it does. I think that knowledge is a deeply important social concept. And this is supposed to resist a current trend in epistemology where, well, it's a trend that really goes back to ancient skepticism. Anyone who thinks that skepticism's true is going to say that we have almost no knowledge or no knowledge at all. And if that's right, then it seems like we never really knew anything, but we got along just fine. Like, we're still here today. So it would at least imply that knowledge maybe isn't that important if skepticism were true. Furthermore, there are some people who think that knowledge isn't really the central epistemic concept. They want to say things like understanding is more central, or wisdom is more central, like these are more important concepts in some way. I don't actually think that's true. I think that knowledge is kind of the really important concept in our epistemology. So what I want to do today is provide a story or an account of why that is. So I want to tell a story about how concepts kind of evolve, how they come to be, and why it is that the concept of knowledge came about. So basically try and answer the question, why is it that humans think and talk about knowledge, and in answering that question, shed light on what I think knowledge is, as well as why it's valuable. So the first thing I want to do is just start with some observations or some facts about knowledge that have been remarked on in various literatures. So I think these are 4 pretty important facts which suggest that knowledge is valuable or important or significant in some way. So the first fact is that it's one of the 10 most commonly used verbs in English. So I've given it's the 8th most common actually. And below you can see the 7 which come before it. And they're all pretty basic words that you'd imagine we'd utter at quite a high rate, right? So be, have, do, say, get, make, go, and then know. So know features before a lot of other words, many other verbs in the English language, which would suggest that it's actually quite important, that it's playing certain roles when we talk. The second one is that it's not just one of the most commonly used verbs, but it's the first cognitive word that children learn. So they learn this word before they learn things like thinks or believes or understands or remembers, which might suggest that if this is really the first word that children in general learn, it's going to be more important, right? They use it more, it's serving more roles than all these other kinds of nearby concepts. So that's another fact about knowledge. The third one is that it's also the most frequently used term that we use in epistemic assessment just in life. When we're assessing people's epistemic position, there are a variety of ways in which we can do that. We can talk about people being justified, we can talk about them being warranted or reliable, but really mostly we talk about people knowing and not knowing things. So again, that suggests that knowledge is much more important than these other kind of closely related concepts like justification or warrant. And then the last one, which I think is really the most interesting, but perhaps also the most controversial, is there are some linguists who engage in a kind of cross-cultural semantics. It's a research program that I'm not really going to go into detail about, but it's called natural semantic meta-language. And what these researchers do is they try and look for words that are called semantic primes or universals. So these are words where you can find a precise meaning equivalent in any natural language, in any human language. And what some of these researchers have said is that the word know is one of these semantic primes, is one of these universal words. So the English word know finds a precise meaning equivalent in any human language. And this is supposed to contrast virtually every other word in English. The list of semantic primes is, I think, under 100. It's around 92 there are in total, and know is one of them. And this even is in contrast to seemingly universal states or emotions like sad and angry. These are words in English which don't find precise meaning equivalents in other languages. The same goes for even words like eat or drink. Some cultures get by with just a single word for that, ingest, right? But nevertheless, know is a word which seems to exist in all human languages. And for that reason, it's pretty good evidence, I think, that no human society really gets by or could get by without something like a concept of knowledge. So again, there's a reason to think that knowledge is really important. So I take this to suggest that knowledge talk, as I'm going to call it, plays important and perhaps even indispensable or essential or fundamental roles in human life and thought. And this is connected with three sorts of questions, all of which I'm going to try and answer today really quickly. So it's going to maybe race by. But what I'm going to try and do is give an account of what knowledge is. Once I've given that account and we're aware of what knowledge is and why it's come about, it'll help to shed light on why knowledge is important, right? Which is hopefully the lesson we take from those facts about knowledge, that knowledge seems to be very important to us, given that no human society can get by without it. And then the third one is it also sheds light on what life might have been like if we don't have something like a concept of knowledge, or if humans didn't think and talk about knowledge. What would we be missing? Would our life be impoverished in some way if we were missing knowledge, or if we didn't think and talk about knowledge? So I'm actually going to start with the number 3 and engage in a kind of thought experiment that's suggested by a philosopher named Edward Craig, who's very inspirational in terms of this talk. A lot of the things I'm going to say are at least loosely connected up with some views that Craig defends. So Craig proposes this notion of an epistemic state of nature. And what an epistemic state of nature is supposed to be is something like a fictional past in which our ancestors existed. So these are people very much like us in terms of their psychology, in terms of their needs, their interests, their circumstances even. But nevertheless, this is a group of people or a community that lack the concept of knowledge, right? So then the question is, in such an epistemic state of nature, what would things be like? What would they be missing if they didn't have this concept? How would they be worse off? Would they be impoverished in some kind of way? And this approach is similar to an approach taken in other areas of philosophy. So Thomas Hobbes is someone, for instance, who wanted to give an account of the emergence of government in this sort of way. So he wanted to look at humans in a state of nature, and the question he asked was, well, in this state in which there was nothing like organized government, how would things be like? Why would we want to exit that situation? And how would government come about, right? So if humans didn't have government, we can think about how life might be worse in the state of nature, and that would motivate us to something like having organized government. So Hobbes' view is that this kind of state of nature without government was one that was, as he puts it, solitary, brutish, nasty, and short. And what I want to argue today is that in this sort of epistemic state of nature where humans lack a concept of knowledge, whether brutish and nasty or not, I think that life would be much more solitary and almost certainly shorter. So knowledge is very, very important to us in terms of our communicative practices. So the way I want to start is with some just plausible assumptions, I think, about inquiry in general. And these are going to form the backdrop of the account that I want to give. So human beings are inquirers. We often need to have true beliefs about our environment. So what I take to be a good starting point is that as humans, we need true beliefs to successfully guide our actions. And you can fill this out in a number of ways, right? So in order to live to adulthood, I need true beliefs about the kinds of foods that will and won't poison me, for instance, or the sorts of things that are good for me, how to be healthy, etc. Even just to find my way to DePauw today, I needed true beliefs about like which plane to get on and, you know, what Andy's phone number is to call him, to meet him, stuff like that. So we need true beliefs to guide our actions. Given that we need true beliefs to guide our actions, it's also going to follow that we need sources of information that will give us true beliefs, right? Now, one of the most natural starting points in terms of sources of information is to think of ourselves, to think of our onboard sources, like our eyes, our ears, and just sensory perception in general, right? So it's often the case that we can acquire true beliefs through these onboard sources, as I'm calling them. That said, I don't think that this is the most efficient way. Sorry, it's maybe efficient, but it's not the most effective way of acquiring a wide range of true beliefs. And that's just because our own experiences are very limited. So what I think is that one of the easiest and efficient ways of acquiring a wide set of true beliefs is by asking other people who we take to be reliable, right? And this point really comes out in a lot of the recent literature on in the epistemology of testimony. So a lot of people have argued that it's really like we are massively dependent on others for acquiring true beliefs and for acquiring knowledge. So just to give you like a really easy example, I take myself to know that I was born in New Jersey, but that's not really from an onboard source, right? I don't remember being born in New Jersey. Rather, my parents told me, I've seen my birth certificate, but these are kind of external sources of information, right? They're people or documents that I take to be reliable sources, which then give me this true belief. It's not something that I've gathered through my onboard sources. And I think this is true for most of our beliefs, actually. Most of them are formed on the basis of sources of information that are outside of us. Okay, so we need true beliefs. We need sources of information that'll give us true beliefs. One of the best sources is other people. For that reason, one thing we're going to need to do is to sort, right, different people, because on almost any issue, there are going to be some people who are more and less reliable, right? So I might be really reliable in terms of restaurants to eat at in Toronto because I spent 23 years there, whereas other people who've never been to Toronto are less reliable about that, right? So on virtually any issue, there's going to be differences in the level of reliability that people have, right? And because there are going to be these differences, what we need is something like a way to sort the more reliable people from the less reliable people, right? We need a way to identify or mark or flag the people that we take to be especially reliable sources of information. And the hypothesis that I want to try out is knowledge is basically that concept or that word. We have the word knowledge because knowledge is what picks out these especially kind of reliable people, all right, the people from whom we can take information and then act on it in order to help guide our actions. So this hypothesis has been gestured at several years ago by a few people. So Bernard Williams at one point says, to find knowledge is to find, quote, somebody who is a reliable source of information about something. So this was in 1973. But he didn't really spell it out. He just sort of mentioned this almost in passing. Another person who's floated this hypothesis a year later was Ernest Sosa in 1974, who says, the honorific term knowledgeable is to be applied only to those who are reliable sources of information, surely an important category for language-using social species. So here you can very much see Sosa even pointing to the fact that it explains the emergence of this concept, right? It's serving certain important roles for us, given that we're a language-using social species. The third one is Edward Craig, who I mentioned earlier, who's really the main source of inspiration for this view. Here he states the view in kind of a ill-formed way, I think. He says the concept of knowledge is used to flag approved sources of information. So notice the difference here between approved sources of information and I think what are taken to be reliable sources, where reliable is often linked up with people in general. So Sosa, I think, has in mind, when he's talking here, informants, right? Reliable informants or agents. Whereas Craig is talking about sources of information where sources seems to be more general, right? So for instance, tree rings are a reliable source of information for the age of a tree or something like that, right? But we wouldn't call a tree stump or tree rings a reliable informant, right? So what I'm interested specifically is not reliable or approved sources of information, but rather informants themselves, so people. And the reason I think this is because really knowledge is a link between a person and a fact. So knowledge requires a knower. So knowledge isn't out there, as I put it. Although we sometimes speak in this way, we sometimes portray knowledge as this kind of free-flowing impersonal resource. We'll say things like, you know, books contain knowledge, libraries or databases contain knowledge. I don't actually think that's true. I think we're speaking loosely when we say things like that. I don't think that knowledge is something like a resource that's out there in the way that we might talk about, say, water or gold. And the reason for this is because I don't think knowledge would exist if sentient life were wiped out, right? We couldn't say that there is knowledge if there were just no sentient life. So to give you a really kind of easy example to help illustrate this, imagine that I take a coin out of my pocket, I flip it, catch it, and cover it on my hand, right? And it's unrevealed. So it's not yet known whether the coin has landed heads or tails, but nevertheless, there's a fact of the matter, right? Like, that's settled. There is a fact, but it's not known. And the reason it's not known is because there's no knower, right? That's linked up with that fact in the appropriate way. So I think knowledge, the right way to think about knowledge is very much in connection with people, with agents, rather than with things in the world that aren't agents. So going back to this, there is this question of, the main hypothesis that I'm running here is knowledge is essentially a word used to flag a kind of reliable informant. But then this question arises, well, reliable for who, right? Because sometimes we have different expectations for our informants, the people giving us information. So if something's not really important for me, I might not require a lot of reliability, right? So for instance, imagine that I have like kind of a minor dislike for peanuts or peanut oil. And a friend has invited me to dinner for 2 weeks from now, and I say, by the way, I don't really like peanuts, so just don't include anything like peanut related in the dinner, right? But I said this 2 weeks before the dinner, and I know my friend maybe is kind of forgetful or had a busy week or something. When it comes to attending the dinner, I might take the mere fact that I've given them that sort of warning 2 weeks ago to be sufficient for me, kind of reliable enough, because I'm not deathly allergic to peanuts or anything like that. So I take that as sort of reliable enough for me to go to the dinner and eat it. And if there happens to be peanuts, then so be it. But it's reliable enough for me to have just said that, right? But it doesn't seem like in this case, I know that the person hasn't put peanuts in the dinner, right? And the reason I don't know is because it's quite possible that they forgot or something like that, because it was 2 weeks ago that I mentioned this, and they were busy at the time and maybe seemed absent-minded or something like that. So it's maybe reliable enough for me, but it's not reliable enough for a lot of other people, like people who are allergic to peanuts, right? What they would want is more information. They would want more reliability. So they'd want to follow up with that person maybe when they arrive that day and confirm that there's actually no peanuts or peanut oil in the dinner. So what this is supposed to illustrate is that sometimes what counts as reliable enough for me is going to differ from what counts as reliable enough for you, right? If you're the kind of person for whom it's really important that there's no peanuts in the dinner, or whatever the case may be, depending on how you set up the example. So what I think is when we're talking about an informant being reliable in terms of a knower, they have to be sufficiently reliable for a wide range of interests, right? So knowledge isn't tied to reliability just for you or just for me, but rather knowledge is what picks out someone who's sufficiently reliable for something like the community in general, right? For people with diverse interests and preferences. So that's going to up the standard, right? That's going to up it to a point where you're reliable enough for a lot of different people, for a lot of different reasons. And once you satisfy that communal kind of standard, I think that's when you qualify as a knower. Now, there's a worry here that this might seem kind of vague, but I'm not actually too worried about that because I think knowledge is vague. I think that there are going to be hard cases and that concepts aren't clear at their edges. But nevertheless, what I think's interesting about this and useful is we can think about it on a case-by-case basis, and lots of us will agree in general, I think, about the kinds of things you need to do versus the kinds of things you don't need to do in order to qualify as a knower. So I'll give you a couple examples to try and help illustrate this. So this is a case that comes from John Austin. John Austin says, I'm looking out into my garden and I see a bird, and the bird looks like a goldfinch, right? And then, what does it take to know that that bird's a goldfinch? Well, Austin says, if it's in an area in which there are also canaries, and canaries are very similar looking to goldfinches, then in order to know it's a goldfinch, I need to know it's not a canary, right? That seems reasonable and something that I think most of us will agree with. What's something I don't need to do in order to know that it's a goldfinch? I don't need to rule out the possibility, say, that it's a hologram that's being shot down from an alien ship or something like that, right? We could sort of agree that that's not the kind of thing we need to do in order to qualify as knowing that this is a canary. And I think when we proceed on this sort of case-by-case basis, we're going to see that there is kind of consensus about the sorts of possibilities we do need to rule out versus the possibilities we don't need to rule out. And the reason for this is because knowledge is a social practice, right? We all kind of grow up into it, and we're aware of the sorts of things that humans need to do versus the sorts of things they don't need to do in order to truly qualify as knowing. And for that reason, I think it's, although knowledge might be a bit vague at the edges, nevertheless, there will be pretty wide consensus about a wide range of cases. Okay, so I think that knowledge, the main hypothesis is that knowledge is used to flag reliable informants because those are important for us to get true beliefs on which we can act. But it's related to a couple of nearby hypotheses as well, or they're all kind of deeply connected in a way that I want to give a unifying treatment for. So I think that knowledge is also important, and the reason we talk about it and think about knowledge is because we often need to store, retrieve, and share information. So this is another way in which knowledge is deeply social. So it's often true that I'll have an interest in collecting information that's good or reliable without knowing when in the future it might be needed, right? So earlier at lunch today, I was expressing my dislike for cantaloupes. I think they're like the worst kind of melon. So you can imagine that I go to the grocery store twice a week, and I see cantaloupes being sold at this grocery store twice a week, and they always have cantaloupes, right? I don't have any particular interest in buying cantaloupes or anything like that, but nevertheless, given the reliable information I have, right, I'd qualify as knowing that that store sells cantaloupes, right? And I'd qualify as knowing this because maybe in the future, I need a way of expressing that level of reliability. Like maybe one day I will need a cantaloupe, or maybe one day a friend of mine is going to need to know where they can get cantaloupes, right? So having this concept of knowledge is a way for me to express, both to myself and to other people, that I'm a reliable source of information about the location of cantaloupes, right? And that's just one very simple example, right? But you can do this for a number of things. Anytime we claim to know something, what we're doing is we're identifying ourselves as reliable sources of information, right? Someone who's achieved that kind of community level of reliability such that other people can rely on us. And I think that's true not just for ourselves in the future, but also we're going to want other people to do the same thing, even though they don't have our own interests in mind, right? So if you can imagine I'm at a friend's house for dinner and I want to know, what's the closest place to get anything, right? What's the closest place to get red wine, right? Or if I say to my friend, do you know the closest place to get red wine? And they say, yeah, it's 2 blocks this way. They might not drink alcohol. They might have no interest in purchasing red wine or anything like that. But they would nevertheless qualify as a reliable source of information, right? And therefore a knower, if they reach that level of reliability such that I can act on the information that they've given me, right? So it's in my interest and it's in other people's interest to have a way of storing and identifying, right, once you've reached that level such that we can share the sort of information that we have, right? And in that way, I think the concept of knowledge, again, is deeply social because we really need, given how dependent we are on other people for true beliefs, we really need a way to kind of store information, retrieve it at future dates, and then share it with other people. So knowledge is supposed to serve that role too. It serves something like a trans-contextual role, like it goes beyond just the immediate context in which that information's come about. And a third way, this is a third kind of closely related role of knowledge, is that we often use this term to signal the appropriate end of inquiry, right? So if we think of inquiry as a process of ruling out various possibilities, when you come to know something, that's the point at which you can stop inquiring, right? So an example would be, for instance, I have a cat named Possum, and Possum likes to hide in the house a lot, and you can imagine that I'm trying to locate Possum, and I want to know if Possum's in the study. So what are the kinds of things that I need to do in order to know that, right? In order to know that Possum's not in the study? Well, I need to maybe check behind the door, right? Check all the usual places that I know Possum hides. But then there are also going to be things that I don't need to do, right? I don't need to check the closed, locked drawer of my desk because there's no way that Possum got the key, opened it, and locked himself in. I don't need to feel every corner of the room because it's possible that possum was made invisible by a potion or something like that, right? So when I come to know that possum's not in the study, I do so by ruling out various possibilities. And once I've ruled out all the ones that, sort of as a community, we've agreed implicitly are the type that we need to rule out, then I know, right? Then I've satisfied that community level standard, and that's the point at which I can stop inquiring. And the reason this is important is because the process of inquiry in general is really open-ended, right? If it was true that we needed to rule out these kinds of really radical possibilities, like possum having locked himself in the locked drawer, or the invisible potion possibilities, we could sort of go on forever, right? We can think of all sorts of logically possible things consistent with my not having seen possum, right? But because inquiry is open-ended, we're going to need some kind of stopping point, right? And what I'm proposing is that once you've satisfied the sort of community level of reliability, reliable enough for most people given the sorts of situations we encounter and things we agree on, that's the point at which you qualify as a reliably enough informant to merit the certification as of a knower, right? And that's also signaling the point at which information can be pooled and appropriately shared with other people, and also indicating the point at which inquiry can reasonably be terminated, right? So there are a variety of different roles, but they're really closely connected that knowledge talk is playing in human life and thought, right? It's signaling reliability, it's allowing us to appropriately pool and share, and it's also allowing us to end inquiry in a reasonable sort of way. So the reason I really like this hypothesis is because it's very unifying, right? It explains a lot of different roles. Now, there's this worry of skepticism. So I'm not going to go too much into the history of philosophy here. Skepticism has been around for a long time. It's sort of the bane of epistemology, where pretty much every epistemologist has had something to say on skepticism. Skepticism is just the worry, roughly, right, that human beings have no knowledge or almost no knowledge, say. Or at least that's how I'm going to understand it. There might be other ways of understanding it. So you might think that the hypothesis that I'm proposing could lead us to skepticism. And the reason you might think that is because I'm suggesting that we need a concept to identify people who are reliable enough for a diverse range of purposes, right? For many different possible people. And the worry is that, well, some members out there, some members of the community might be especially skeptical people, right? Or people for whom certain information is super, super important, right? Which is going to drive the standards up. So an example might be anyone who's an epistemologist who's a real-life skeptic and thinks that we do need to do things like rule out those crazy alternative possibilities. There are such people, right? And you might think that so long as there are such people, in order for me to qualify as reliable enough in general, I need to satisfy that standard too, right? So there's this worry that, yeah, in order to qualify as reliable for the community, you're going to have to heighten the standard to satisfy like everyone's concerns. And that's going to include radically skeptical concerns, and from that it's going to follow that no one knows anything. But I actually think that this hypothesis doesn't lead you to skepticism. Rather, it gives you a really good kind of principled reason for not being a skeptic. And the reason is supposed to be just that, well, the concept of knowledge has come about to serve certain functions, right? To allow us to pool, share information, to identify reliable informants, things like that. If skepticism were true, we would really have no use for that kind of concept, right? If it was true that no one knew anything, why would we even need a concept of knowledge? What would we be doing when we were identifying people as knowers? We would just be systematically false about it. So it doesn't seem like that concept's going to be playing anything like an important social role, right? We would just be misapplying this concept across the board. Furthermore, it doesn't seem like there can be any practical purposes that are served by having a test like this that everyone's bound to fail, right? So if the skeptic's right, then if the skeptic's right, then we need to rule out these sorts of really radical possibilities in order to qualify as knowing, right? I would need to rule out the possibility that my cat was turned invisible. I would need to rule out the possibility that I'm not a brain in a vat, or that I'm not currently dreaming that I'm here. All sorts of things, right? If skepticism's right, then it suggests that the standard's going to be super, super high. But really, again, there's no practical purpose for having a kind of test to qualify as a knower where everyone's bound to fail it, because we're all fallible, right? It's not possible for any of us to rule out all these possibilities. And for that reason, if we really are concerned with having something like a social picture, and if the motivation I've given earlier about those plausible assumptions about needing to identify reliable informants and sorting them out are right, then having a concept of knowledge that's sort of structured in the way that the skeptic thinks it's structured just couldn't possibly be doing any work for us, right? Because it wouldn't be allowing us to sort more and less reliable people, because everyone's unreliable in this picture. No one's good enough for information on which we can act, right? Because they don't qualify as knowing. So there'd be something very weird about the kind of making compatible the social picture I'm giving with these kinds of skeptical concerns, with the sort of demand that the skeptic has put in front of us. So for this reason, I think we should expect something like downward pressure on the standards for knowledge. So it works in both directions, and that's what gives us this kind of community level standard. So on the one hand, it's not just that I need someone reliable enough for me, but rather I need someone reliable enough for most people, right, with like reasonable aims and projects or something like that. So that's going to drive the standards of reliability or justification up pretty high, right? So it's not easy to qualify as a knower, because knowers are people on whom many others can rely. So that drives the standard up. But it doesn't go so high as skepticism, because practical considerations push them lower than that, right? Because we need a concept that's still useful to us, right? That still allows us to identify people on whom we can rely for information on which we can act. And for that reason, we're going to expect the standard to meet somewhere in the middle, right? Maybe it's a bit higher, but there is going to be both upward and downward pressure, which keeps it from being easy knowledge and also keeps it from being skeptically high. So in this way, I think the concept of knowledge really is used to facilitate the flourishing of human beings in communities, right? Because we have this need to share information, we have this need to identify reliable informants. It allows us to acquire true beliefs on which we can act. So it gives a nice unifying explanation for the role of identifying reliable informants, this ability to pool, share information, and also allowing us to appropriately signal the end of inquiry, right? Because we're finite beings with limited resources and inquiry can't go on forever. So I do think that there's a really deep need for knowledge. But when I say that there's a need for knowledge, one thing I do want to step back from is I don't want to say that this need is as strong as a lot of other needs. So it's not as strong as, say, our need for food or water or shelter or something like that. Maybe it's possible that the human societies could have got by without the concept of knowledge. So I don't want to suggest that if there were such a society, everyone would die out, right? Like everyone in the epistemic state of nature would just die out without knowledge. That seems too radical. But nevertheless, I do think they'd be massively impoverished, right, in an epistemic way. It'd be incredibly difficult for them to share useful information, and so their range of things that of information on which they can reliably act would massively shrink. So I think knowledge is very important and somewhat necessary, but I'm not sure I'd say it's as necessary as food or water. Yeah, and for that reason, I think that life without knowledge, as I said earlier, whether brutish and nasty or not, would certainly be more solitary and probably shorter. That's it. Thank you.